October 23, 1942, Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. Radio operator first class, Danny Sullivan hunches over his SCR-300 radio in a steamy jungle foxhole, sweat dripping onto the frequency dial. Static fills his headphones. Then, cutting through the white noise, he hears it. Japanese voices, clear as day, coordinating an artillery strike on his battalion's position. Sullivan knows enough Japanese from his missionary parents to understand the coordinates. They're talking about grid reference 247-189. That's exactly where his Marines are dug in. He reaches for his handset to warn command, but stops. An idea forms in his mind. An insane idea that violates every radio protocol the Marine Corps ever taught him. What if instead of just listening to enemy communications, he could disrupt them? What if he could turn their own radio network against them? 20 minutes later, Japanese artillery rounds slam into empty jungle, 800 yards north of the Marine positions. The enemy gunners, following coordinates Sullivan fed them through their own radio net, have just wasted 200 rounds of precious ammunition hitting nothing but trees and dirt. What radio operator Sullivan doesn't know is that his unauthorized experiment will evolve into the most controversial communications technique of World War II, a method so effective that enemy forces will call it psychological warfare, so dangerous that his own command will try to ban it, and so successful that it will save thousands of American lives while driving Japanese radio operators to nervous breakdowns. This is the story of the technique they called frequency intrusion, the innovation that turned radio warfare upside down, and the young Marine who proved that sometimes the best weapon isn't what you're trained to use, it's what you're trained never to touch. To understand why Sullivan's technique proved so revolutionary, you need to understand how radio warfare worked in 1942. Both sides monitored each other's communications constantly. Japanese intelligence units stationed across the Pacific intercepted American radio traffic, trying to decode operational plans. American signal intelligence did the same, listening to enemy frequencies, plotting unit movements, predicting attacks. But monitoring was passive. You listened, you recorded, you analyzed. You never under any circumstances transmitted on enemy frequencies. That was the cardinal rule of radio warfare. Transmit on their networks, and you risk compromising your own position, revealing your capabilities, creating electronic signatures that enemy direction finders could trace back to your location. Radio operator first class Daniel Patrick Sullivan grew up breaking rules. Born March 15, 1921, in San Francisco, California, Sullivan spent his childhood with missionary parents in the Philippines. His father ran a Methodist mission in Manila. His mother taught English to local children. Danny learned Tagalog, Japanese, and Mandarin before he mastered algebra. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, the Sullivan family evacuated to California on one of the last civilian ships out of Manila. Danny enlisted in the Marines 2 days after his 21st birthday. Not because he wanted to be a hero, but because he wanted revenge for what he'd seen the Japanese do to Filipino civilians during the invasion. The Marines trained him as a radio operator because he was small enough to carry the heavy SCR-300 backpack radio and smart enough to handle complex frequency management. His instructors noted adequate technical skills and satisfactory adherence to communication protocols. Nobody identified him as exceptional. He was just another Marine, another radio operator, another replaceable part in the vast machinery of amphibious warfare. But Sullivan possessed one quality his training records couldn't capture. He understood that radio signals weren't just technical data, they were human voices, voices belonging to real people with real fears, real confusion, real mistakes, and people, Sullivan knew from growing up overseas, could be manipulated. October 23, 1942, Guadalcanal. The Japanese have been reinforcing their positions on the island for 6 weeks. Every night, the Tokyo Express runs down the slot, bringing fresh troops, ammunition, and supplies. Every day, American forces try to push them back toward the sea. The fighting is brutal, close range, and desperate. Sullivan's battalion, the 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, holds a section of the perimeter near Henderson Field. For 3 days, Japanese artillery has been pounding their positions with devastating accuracy. The enemy forward observers, hidden in the jungle canopy, can see every American movement. They call in strikes with surgical precision. American counter-battery fire proves useless. The Japanese guns move constantly, firing a few rounds, then displacing before American artillery can respond. It's a deadly game of cat and mouse, and the Marines are losing. That's when Sullivan notices something interesting about Japanese radio discipline. Unlike American forces, who use complex code words and authentication procedures, the Japanese artillery networks operate with minimal security. They use simple numerical codes for grid references. They repeat coordinates multiple times to ensure accuracy. Most importantly, they don't verify the identity of stations calling in fire missions. Their system assumes that anyone transmitting on their frequency must be legitimate. After all, who would be crazy enough to break onto an enemy radio network? Danny Sullivan, apparently. His first attempt is crude but effective. He waits until a Japanese forward observer calls in a fire mission, then transmits immediately afterward in broken Japanese, claiming to be another observer with updated coordinates. He shifts the target grid 200 meters north. The artillery dutifully fires at the new coordinates, missing the actual Marine positions entirely. It works once, then twice. By the fourth attempt, Sullivan has refined his technique. He's learned the radio call signs Japanese observers use. He's memorized their standard phraseology. Most importantly, he's figured out how to sound panicked and urgent, like a forward observer under fire who desperately needs artillery support. The psychological element proves crucial. In the chaos of combat, radio operators don't question frantic voices calling for help. They respond. They follow orders. They fire where they're told to fire. Within a week, Sullivan has turned the Japanese artillery network into his personal weapon. He feeds them false coordinates, delays time-sensitive fire missions, and creates confusion that saves Marine lives every single day. Enemy gunners waste thousands of rounds hitting empty jungle, while American positions remain untouched. But Sullivan's innovation goes beyond simple misdirection. He starts gathering intelligence through his false transmissions. When he calls in fake fire missions, Japanese artillery units respond with their locations, ammunition status, and operational schedules, information that would be impossible to collect through passive monitoring alone. The intelligence proves invaluable. American counter-battery fire, guided by Sullivan's gathered data, destroys 3 Japanese gun positions in 2 days. Forward observers, their locations compromised through Sullivan's technique, are eliminated by Marine sniper teams. The enemy artillery threat that had paralyzed American operations for weeks suddenly collapses. Word spreads through the 2nd Battalion, then the regiment, then the division. The radio operator who's been sabotaging Japanese communications becomes a legend. Marines start requesting Sullivan's frequency intrusion support for their operations. Company commanders plan attacks around his ability to disrupt enemy coordination. But not everyone appreciates Sullivan's innovation. November 8, 1942, Division Headquarters, Guadalcanal. Sullivan stands at attention in a sweltering tent while Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, the division signal officer, reads from a stack of reports. Morrison is a career officer, a graduate of the Naval Academy, a man who believes in regulations, proper procedures, and following established doctrine. Radio Operator Sullivan, Morrison begins, his voice tight with military precision. You've been conducting unauthorized transmissions on enemy frequencies. This violates Communication Security Regulation 47B, which explicitly prohibits transmitting on hostile networks. It violates Operational Security Protocol 12A, which forbids revealing American capabilities to the enemy, and it violates basic military discipline, which requires following orders rather than improvising unauthorized techniques. Sullivan remains at attention. Yes, sir, these violations could result in court-martial, Morrison continues. More importantly, your actions have compromised American radio security. Every time you transmit on Japanese frequencies, you risk exposing our positions, our capabilities, our operational methods. You're endangering every Marine on this island. Sir, Sullivan says carefully, the technique has been saving lives. We've eliminated multiple enemy artillery positions using intelligence gathered through frequency intrusion. Marine casualties from artillery strikes have dropped 70% since I began operations. That's not the point, Morrison snaps. The point is discipline. The point is following established procedures. The point is that individual Marines don't get to decide which regulations they'll obey and which they'll ignore. The tent falls silent, except for the distant sound of artillery. American artillery, Sullivan notes, firing at coordinates he provided through his illegal transmissions. Morrison walks to his field desk and pulls out a typewritten order. Effective immediately, you will cease all frequency intrusion activities. You will monitor assigned frequencies only. You will not transmit on enemy networks under any circumstances. Any violation of this order will result in immediate court-martial and reduction in rank. Is that understood? Sullivan stares straight ahead. Understood, sir. But understanding an order and following it are different things. That night, as Japanese artillery begins its usual bombardment of Marine positions, Sullivan sits in his foxhole, listening to enemy coordinates crackling through his headphones. He watches tracer rounds arc overhead, heading toward his fellow Marines. He counts the explosions, each one potentially killing men he's served with for months. His hand moves toward the radio transmit key, then stops, then moves again. What happens next will determine whether frequency intrusion becomes an official Marine Corps technique or disappears forever as the unauthorized experiment of one radio operator. But Sullivan's decision in that steaming jungle foxhole will echo through military communications for the next 80 years, influencing everything from Cold War espionage to modern cyber warfare. Because sometimes the most dangerous innovations aren't the ones that follow doctrine. They're the ones that shatter it completely. The decision comes at 23:47 hours. A Japanese forward observer's voice crackles through Sullivan's headphones, calling in a fire mission on grid reference 312-456. Sullivan knows that grid. It's where Charlie Company dug in 3 hours ago. 43 Marines, including his friend Corporal Tommy Martinez from San Antonio, are sleeping in foxholes at those exact coordinates. Sullivan keys his handset. Speaking in rapid Japanese, he identifies himself as Observer Unit 7 and requests immediate correction to the fire mission. The target has moved, he reports breathlessly. New coordinates, 315-462, 600 meters northeast of the actual Marine positions. The Japanese artillery commander acknowledges. Rounds incoming on revised target in 2 minutes. Sullivan closes his eyes and listens. The shells whistle overhead, impacting harmlessly in empty jungle. Charlie Company sleeps undisturbed. Martinez lives to see another dawn. Colonel Morrison's order becomes irrelevant. Some rules exist to be broken when breaking them saves lives. November the 12th, 1942. Sullivan's technique evolves rapidly. He's no longer just misdirecting artillery fire. He's creating systematic chaos throughout the Japanese communication network. His method is elegant in its simplicity. Listen to enemy radio traffic, identify vulnerable moments when confusion is already high, then inject false information that amplifies existing problems. During a Japanese infantry assault on November 15th, Sullivan monitors their coordination frequency as 3 companies attempt to converge on Henderson Field. The attack plan is solid, but execution in jungle terrain creates natural confusion. Units lose contact. Officers can't locate their subordinates. Radio discipline breaks down as commanders demand status updates. Sullivan recognizes opportunity. He begins transmitting as various Japanese unit commanders, issuing contradictory orders, reporting false positions, claiming enemy contact where none exists. The assault dissolves into chaos. Japanese companies fire on each other in the darkness, convinced they're engaging American forces. The attack fails before it reaches Marine lines. What Sullivan doesn't realize is that his frequency intrusion technique is creating psychological effects beyond simple tactical confusion. Japanese radio operators, already stressed by constant combat, begin questioning every transmission they receive. Is this voice legitimate? Is this order real? Are they being manipulated? Paranoia spreads through enemy communication networks like a virus. Japanese units demand authentication codes that don't exist. Officers refuse orders that sound suspicious. Radio operators hesitate to relay critical information, fearing they're being deceived. The entire command structure begins breaking down, not from American firepower, but from self-doubt. A captured Japanese radio operator, interrogated on November 18th, provides insight into the psychological impact. Through a translator, he explains that his unit stopped trusting radio communications entirely after receiving contradictory orders for 3 straight days. They reverted to messenger runners, slowing their operations significantly and making coordination nearly impossible. The interrogation report reaches division headquarters. Colonel Morrison reads it twice, then walks to his communications tent where Sullivan is monitoring Japanese frequencies during his assigned shift. Radio operator Sullivan, Morrison says quietly, "I need to speak with you privately." They walk outside, away from other personnel. Morrison lights a cigarette with shaking hands. The stress of commanding communications for an entire division in combat conditions has aged him visibly in the past month. "That order I gave you last week," Morrison begins, "about ceasing frequency intrusion activities. I'm rescinding it." Sullivan says nothing, waiting. "Your technique," Morrison continues, "is having strategic impact beyond anything we anticipated. Japanese communication discipline has collapsed across the entire sector. Their units can't coordinate effectively. They're making tactical errors because they don't trust their own radio networks." Morrison takes a long drag from his cigarette. "How many enemy artillery positions have you eliminated using intelligence gathered through your transmissions?" 17 confirmed, sir. Maybe 21. "And Marine casualties from artillery strikes?" "Down 86% over the past 3 weeks, sir." Morrison nods slowly. "I want you to train others. Select 6 radio operators. Teach them your methods. We're implementing frequency intrusion as official doctrine for this division." Sullivan feels a mixture of vindication and responsibility. "Yes, sir. But, sir, there are risks. If the Japanese figure out what we're doing, they'll change their procedures. They'll implement authentication codes, frequency rotation, better communication security. This technique works because they don't expect it. Once they adapt, it becomes much harder." Morrison meets his eyes. "How long before they adapt?" Sullivan considers the question. "Based on their current reaction patterns, maybe 2 months. 3 at most. They're already showing signs of increased paranoia. Eventually, someone will figure out they're being manipulated systematically. Then we use those 2 months to maximum advantage, Morrison says. Train your people, document your procedures, extract every possible benefit before they catch on. December 1942. Sullivan establishes what becomes known unofficially as the Deception Section, 6 radio operators trained in frequency intrusion techniques. The selection criteria are unusual for Marine Corps standards. Language skills matter more than technical proficiency. Creativity matters more than adherence to regulations. The ability to think like the enemy matters more than following American doctrine. Private First Class Robert Chen speaks Mandarin and Japanese. His parents immigrated from Shanghai in 1923. Corporal Michael Kowalski learned German from his grandmother and picks up Japanese syntax quickly. Sergeant James Running Bear grew up on a Navajo reservation speaking 3 languages and understands how different cultures approach communication differently. Each operator develops specialized techniques. Chen excels at impersonating different Japanese dialects, creating false radio personalities that seem completely authentic. Kowalski masters the technical aspects, learning to manipulate radio equipment to simulate transmission from different locations. Running Bear develops an intuitive understanding of Japanese tactical psychology, predicting how enemy commanders will react to specific types of false information. Together, they transform frequency intrusion from Sullivan's individual innovation into systematic psychological warfare. They don't just disrupt enemy communications, they weaponize them. The technique spreads beyond Guadalcanal. Radio operators in other Pacific theaters hear rumors about the Marines who turn Japanese radios against themselves. Requests for training arrive from division commanders across the Pacific. The Marine Corps, initially skeptical of Sullivan's unauthorized experimentation, begins treating frequency intrusion as a legitimate combat technique, but success creates new problems. As more American forces adopt the method, the risk of detection increases exponentially. Japanese intelligence officers, analyzing patterns of communication failures, begin noticing anomalies, radio transmissions that don't quite match established procedures, voices that sound familiar but give contradictory orders, coordination failures that seem too systematic to be accidental. January 15, 1943, Imperial Japanese Navy Intelligence Center, Rabaul. Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Yamamoto studies transcripts of radio intercepts from Guadalcanal operations. Yamamoto is a communications specialist, trained in radio security and counterintelligence. He's been analyzing American signal intelligence capabilities for 6 months, trying to understand why Japanese operations have become so ineffective. The pattern emerges gradually. Communication failures cluster around specific time periods. False orders always arrive during moments of maximum confusion, when verification would be most difficult. Most tellingly, the false transmissions demonstrate detailed knowledge of Japanese procedures, terminology, and tactical doctrine that passive monitoring alone couldn't provide. Yamamoto's conclusion is chilling. The Americans aren't just intercepting Japanese communications, they're actively manipulating them. Enemy agents are transmitting on Japanese frequencies, impersonating legitimate operators, feeding false information into the command structure. His report reaches Admiral Junichi Kusaka, commander of Southeast Area Fleet, on January 20th. Kusaka reads it twice, then summons his communications staff for an emergency meeting. If Yamamoto's analysis is correct, every Japanese radio network in the Pacific has been compromised. Every transmission could be false. Every order could be enemy deception. The psychological impact proves devastating. Japanese forces implement emergency communication protocols that slow operations to a crawl. Officers demand face-to-face verification of all radio orders. Units break radio silence only for life-threatening emergencies. The very fear of frequency intrusion begins degrading Japanese operational effectiveness, even when no Americans are actually transmitting on their networks. But the Japanese adaptation forces American frequency intrusion specialists to evolve their techniques. Simple voice impersonation becomes insufficient when enemy forces start demanding authentication codes. Technical manipulation becomes necessary when Japanese units begin frequency rotation protocols. Sullivan and his team develop new methods. They learn to monitor multiple frequencies simultaneously, following Japanese units as they change radio channels. They create elaborate deceptions involving multiple false transmissions from different positions, making enemy forces believe they're surrounded when they're actually fighting a much smaller American unit. Most innovatively, they begin exploiting Japanese cultural tendencies toward hierarchy and face-saving. False orders that seem to come from senior officers carry more psychological weight than tactical commands. Transmissions that suggest incompetence or cowardice trigger emotional responses that cloud judgment. The Americans learn to weaponize Japanese military culture against itself. The technique reaches its most sophisticated form during the Bougainville campaign in late 1943. Sullivan, now promoted to technical sergeant, coordinates frequency intrusion operations across multiple regiments. His team doesn't just disrupt individual Japanese units. They orchestrate systematic deception campaigns that manipulate entire enemy divisions. The Battle of Empress Augusta Bay becomes their masterpiece. Japanese forces, responding to false radio intelligence fed through their own communication networks, deploy their reserves to defend against American landings that never happen. Meanwhile, the actual marine assault lands unopposed 50 kilometers away, achieving complete tactical surprise because enemy forces are positioned to repel phantom attacks created through frequency intrusion. The success creates an unexpected problem. By early 1944, Sullivan's frequency intrusion techniques have become so effective that they threaten to reveal themselves through their very success. When enemy artillery consistently misses targets by precisely the same margins, when Japanese units repeatedly receive contradictory orders during critical moments, when communication failures follow predictable patterns, enemy intelligence officers start connecting dots. February 3, 1944, Imperial Japanese Army Signal Intelligence Unit, Truk Atoll. Major Hiroshi Tanaka stares at a map covered in red pins, each marking a communication failure that resulted in tactical disaster. Tanaka graduated from Tokyo Imperial University with degrees in mathematics and engineering. He understands patterns, probability, statistical analysis. What he's looking at defies random chance. Artillery missions redirected at the last moment, always by precisely 400 to 800 meters. Infantry coordination breaking down exactly when American forces launch counterattacks. Radio authentication failures spiking during complex operations when verification would be most difficult. The mathematics are impossible to ignore. Tanaka's report reaches Tokyo on February 10th. His conclusion sends shockwaves through Imperial General Headquarters. American forces have developed systematic radio deception techniques that penetrate Japanese communication security. Enemy operators are not just monitoring Japanese frequencies, they are actively controlling them. The Japanese response is swift and comprehensive. On February 15, 1944, Imperial forces across the Pacific implement Emergency Communication Protocol 7. All radio networks convert to hourly frequency rotation. Authentication codes change every 6 hours. Voice recognition procedures require officers to verify identity through personal information that enemy agents couldn't possibly know. Most devastatingly for American operations, Japanese units begin operating under radio silence except for genuine emergencies. The communication networks that Sullivan and his team have been exploiting for 18 months suddenly go dark. March 1, 1944. Sullivan sits in his communication bunker on Bougainville, headphones pressed against his ears, listening to static. For 2 weeks, Japanese radio traffic has dropped to almost nothing. Occasional bursts of coded transmissions, frequency changes every hour, authentication protocols his team can't crack. The frequency intrusion technique that revolutionized Pacific warfare has been neutralized by enemy adaptation. His commanding officer, now Colonel Morrison, promoted after his division's outstanding communication warfare record, visits the bunker that evening. "Sullivan," Morrison says, pulling up a folding chair. "We need to talk." Morrison opens a folder containing intelligence reports from across the Pacific Theater. Every major Japanese formation has implemented the same countermeasures: radio silence, frequency rotation, enhanced security. "Our frequency intrusion capabilities have been reduced by approximately 90%. Sullivan nods. "I know, sir. We've been tracking the changes. They figured us out. The question is," Morrison continues, "what do we do now? Do we abandon the technique entirely? Do we develop new methods? Do we accept that frequency intrusion was effective for 18 months, but has reached the end of its usefulness?" Sullivan considers the question. "Sir, the technique hasn't become useless. It's become harder. The Japanese are so afraid of frequency intrusion that they've crippled their own communication effectiveness. They're not talking to each other because they're terrified we might be listening and responding." "That's a good point, but it doesn't help us disrupt their operations directly." "Maybe it doesn't have to," Sullivan says slowly. "Maybe the fear of frequency intrusion is more powerful than frequency intrusion itself." Morrison raises an eyebrow. "Explain." Sullivan walks to a map showing Japanese defensive positions across the Central Pacific. "Sir, look at their current communication patterns. Radio silence except for emergencies. No coordination between units. Officers afraid to issue orders over radio because they might be fake. They've essentially created the same operational paralysis we were causing through active deception, but now they're doing it to themselves." Morrison studies the map. "So we've won by losing the ability to interfere directly." "In a sense, yes, sir. Our frequency intrusion campaign was so successful that the enemy has implemented countermeasures that damage their operational effectiveness more than our deceptions ever did. They're defeating themselves, trying to prevent us from defeating them." The conversation reveals a crucial aspect of psychological warfare that military theorists will study for decades. Sometimes the most effective weapon isn't the one that destroys enemy capabilities directly. It's the one that forces enemies to destroy their own capabilities while trying to defend against it. Japanese forces, traumatized by 18 months of communication manipulation, have essentially abandoned the radio networks that modern warfare requires. Their units operate in isolation, unable to coordinate complex operations, unable to respond rapidly to changing tactical situations. American forces face enemies who have voluntarily blinded and deafened themselves out of fear. The strategic implications extend far beyond individual battles. Japanese defensive preparations for Operation Forager, the American assault on the Mariana Islands, suffer from coordination failures directly traceable to communication paralysis. Units prepare overlapping defensive zones because they can't coordinate field of fire assignments. Supply distribution becomes chaotic because logistical coordination requires radio networks commanders no longer trust. April 1944, Sullivan receives orders transferring him to Pearl Harbor for a new assignment. Marine Corps intelligence wants him to develop training programs for frequency intrusion techniques, but also to study Japanese countermeasures and devise methods to overcome them. The technique that began as one radio operator's unauthorized experiment has become an official military specialty requiring institutional development. At Pearl Harbor, Sullivan works with a team that includes Navy cryptographers, Army signal intelligence specialists, and civilian academics recruited for their expertise in psychology and communication theory. Together, they analyze thousands of hours of intercepted Japanese radio traffic, looking for vulnerabilities in the new security protocols. What they discover changes American understanding of radio warfare fundamentally. Japanese communication security measures, designed to prevent frequency intrusion, have created new opportunities for different types of deception. Units operating under radio silence reveal their positions through the absence of transmissions. Frequency rotation patterns meant to prevent interception actually help American direction-finding equipment locate enemy radio sites more accurately. Most importantly, Japanese operators, stressed by complex authentication procedures and constant fear of deception, make more mistakes than they did before implementing security measures. They repeat transmissions when authentication fails. They use simplified codes when complex procedures prove too time-consuming during emergencies. They violate their own security protocols when operational pressures mount. Sullivan's team develops new techniques that exploit these behavioral changes. Instead of impersonating Japanese operators, they create false authentication failures that force enemy units to repeat transmissions multiple times, providing American intelligence with detailed information about enemy operations. Instead of feeding false coordinates directly, they trigger Japanese security procedures at critical moments, causing delays that disrupt time-sensitive operations. The evolved frequency intrusion techniques prove even more effective than the original methods because they turn Japanese security measures into weapons against Japanese forces. Every authentication code becomes a potential point of failure. Every security procedure becomes a source of operational delay. Every countermeasure becomes a new vulnerability. By June 1944, American radio warfare specialists are systematically exploiting Japanese communication security to gather intelligence and disrupt operations across the Pacific theater. The technique that began with Danny Sullivan's unauthorized transmissions on Guadalcanal has evolved into sophisticated psychological warfare that influences the outcome of major campaigns. The Battle of the Philippine Sea demonstrates the strategic impact. Japanese fleet operations, hampered by communication security procedures that slow coordination and create confusion, fail to achieve tactical surprise against American forces. Admiral Ozawa's carefully planned carrier strikes become disorganized when his units can't maintain reliable radio contact without triggering their own security protocols. American pilots, guided by intelligence gathered through evolved frequency intrusion techniques, intercept Japanese formations before they reach their targets. The resulting air battle, dubbed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, sees Japanese naval aviation destroyed as an effective fighting force. Communication warfare contributes directly to one of the most decisive victories in Pacific naval history. But Sullivan's greatest innovation isn't tactical or technical, it's conceptual. He proves that radio waves aren't just tools for transmitting information. They're psychological weapons that can be turned against enemies more effectively than conventional firepower. His frequency intrusion techniques don't just disrupt enemy operations. They remake enemy thinking, forcing adversaries to defeat themselves while trying to defend against American deception. The technique's influence extends far beyond individual battles or even campaigns. By late 1944, Sullivan's frequency intrusion methods have fundamentally altered how both sides approach radio warfare. American forces develop specialized units dedicated to communication deception. Japanese forces retreat further into communication isolation, creating operational blindness that American commanders exploit ruthlessly. November 1944. The Philippines campaign reveals the full strategic impact of frequency intrusion warfare. General MacArthur's forces land at Leyte with overwhelming intelligence advantages created through 18 months of Japanese communication paralysis. Enemy defensive preparations, hampered by units afraid to coordinate over radio, collapse into isolated resistance pockets that American forces defeat piecemeal. Technical Sergeant Sullivan, now stationed with the 6th Army Signal Intelligence Service, coordinates frequency intrusion operations across multiple corps. His team has expanded to 43 specialists operating sophisticated equipment that would have seemed impossible 2 years earlier. High-powered transmitters allow them to reach Japanese networks across hundreds of miles. Direction-finding arrays pinpoint enemy radio locations within minutes. Most importantly, psychological profiles help them craft deceptions tailored to specific Japanese commanders and their known behavioral patterns. The sophistication level astounds visiting intelligence officers from Europe. Colonel William Bradford, fresh from Allied communication warfare against German forces, observes Sullivan's operations for 3 days before requesting a private meeting. Sergeant Sullivan, Bradford begins, I've spent 2 years fighting German signal intelligence. The Wehrmacht has excellent communication security, sophisticated encryption, disciplined radio operators. But what you've accomplished against the Japanese represents something entirely different. You've weaponized their own voices against them. Sullivan nods. Sir, it started as simple misdirection, but we learned that psychological pressure creates more operational damage than tactical deception. When enemy commanders can't trust their own communication networks, they make decisions based on fear rather than intelligence. Bradford studies reports showing Japanese operational failures across the Pacific Theater. In Europe, we try to intercept German communications to learn their plans. You've made Japanese communications actively harmful to Japanese operations. Their radio networks have become liabilities rather than assets. That's exactly right, sir. Every time they use radio, they risk receiving false information. Every time they don't use radio, they lose coordination with other units. We've created a situation where Japanese forces damage themselves regardless of their communication choices. The conversation highlights a crucial evolution in warfare that military historians will study for decades. Traditional communication warfare focused on gathering enemy intelligence or denying enemy information. Sullivan's frequency intrusion techniques create a new category, turning enemy communication systems into weapons against enemy forces. December 7, 1944. 3 years to the day after Pearl Harbor, Sullivan receives orders that surprise him. The Marine Corps wants him to return to combat operations, not as a radio operator, but as a communication warfare specialist attached to assault units preparing for the invasion of Japan. His mission: develop field techniques for frequency intrusion that can support amphibious operations against heavily defended enemy positions. The assignment represents both recognition and challenge. Recognition that frequency intrusion has become crucial to American strategy. Challenge because Japanese homeland defenses will employ communication security measures far more sophisticated than anything encountered in the Pacific Islands. At Camp Pendleton, California, Sullivan begins working with Marine assault units scheduled for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan. The tactical problems are enormous. Japanese home island defenses include millions of troops, thousands of artillery pieces, and communication networks that have been hardened against interference for months. Moreover, Japanese forces defending their homeland will fight with desperation that Pacific Island garrisons never displayed. Communication discipline will be tighter. Security procedures will be more rigorously enforced. The psychological vulnerabilities that Sullivan's techniques exploited against isolated island defenders may not exist among troops fighting for their nation's survival. Sullivan's solution is characteristically innovative. Instead of trying to overcome improved Japanese communication security, he decides to exploit it. His team develops techniques that trigger Japanese security protocols at moments when delays will cause maximum operational disruption. They create false emergencies that force enemy units to break radio silence, exposing their positions to American direction-finding equipment. Most cleverly, they use Japanese fears of frequency intrusion to convince enemy commanders that legitimate orders are actually American deceptions. The key insight comes during training exercises with Marine units at Camp Pendleton. Sullivan notices that even American forces, knowing they're participating in training, react emotionally when they receive contradictory orders over radio. Fear, confusion, and anger affect decision-making even when rational analysis should prevail. If American Marines, trained to expect deception during exercises, still react psychologically to false communications, Japanese defenders facing actual invasion will be even more vulnerable. February 1945. Sullivan's techniques face their ultimate test during the Battle of Iwo Jima. Japanese defenders, commanded by General Kuribayashi, have prepared the island with meticulous attention to communication security. Underground cable networks connect defensive positions, operations. Radio traffic is minimized and heavily coded. Authentication procedures are rigorously enforced. But Kuribayashi's very competence creates new opportunities for Sullivan's evolved frequency intrusion methods. The general's detailed defensive plans require precise coordination between artillery positions, infantry units, and supply depots. When that coordination breaks down even briefly, American assault forces can exploit gaps in the defensive system. Sullivan's team, operating from USS El Dorado offshore, begins systematic pressure on Japanese communication networks 3 days before the assault. They don't attempt direct deception initially. Instead, they create authentication failures that force Japanese units to repeat transmissions, providing American intelligence with detailed information about defensive preparations. More importantly, they trigger Japanese security protocols during critical planning periods. When enemy commanders try to coordinate final defensive arrangements, authentication delays disrupt their timing. When artillery observers attempt to register guns on landing beaches, communication security procedures slow their efforts. The Japanese defensive system, designed for maximum effectiveness, becomes less effective because its own security measures interfere with operational requirements. February 19, 1945. D-Day, Iwo Jima. As Marine assault waves approach the beaches, Sullivan's team launches their most sophisticated frequency intrusion operation of the war. They don't try to deceive individual Japanese units. Instead, they orchestrate systematic communication chaos across the entire defensive network. False authentication challenges flood Japanese radio networks, creating delays when split-second timing matters most. Legitimate orders become suspect when they arrive during periods of heavy American electronic interference. Most devastatingly, Japanese commanders begin questioning orders that seem too convenient for American operations, even when those orders are completely authentic. The psychological pressure proves overwhelming for some Japanese radio operators. Intercepted transmissions reveal operators refusing to relay orders they believe might be American deceptions. Units demand face-to-face confirmation of radio instructions, slowing response times during the critical first hours when American forces establish their beachheads. Private First Class Hiroshi Tanaka, captured on February 23rd, provides insight into the psychological impact through interrogation. The American translator records his statement. "We could not trust any voice on radio. Every order might be enemy trick. When real orders came, we spent too much time verifying they were genuine. By the time we confirmed orders were real, American Marines were already advancing." The Battle of Iwo Jima becomes a tragic testament to frequency intrusion's strategic impact. Japanese defenders fight with incredible courage and skill, but their communication system fails them at crucial moments. Artillery support arrives late because fire missions require multiple authentication cycles. Reinforcements move slowly because unit commanders demand written confirmation of radio orders. Counterattacks lose coordination because officers don't trust their own communication networks. American casualties remain horrific because Japanese defensive positions are expertly prepared and courageously defended. But casualty rates would have been even higher without the communication chaos that Sullivan's techniques create throughout the battle. Every delayed Japanese artillery barrage saves American lives. Every disrupted counterattack gives Marine assault units additional time to consolidate positions. March 26, 1945. Iwo Jima is declared secure after 36 days of fighting. Sullivan's after-action report documents frequency intrusion's contribution to the victory, but also reveals its limitations. Against determined defenders fighting on prepared positions, communication warfare provides tactical advantages rather than decisive strategic impact. More importantly, Sullivan identifies a troubling trend in Japanese responses to frequency intrusion. Enemy forces are adapting faster than expected, developing counter-techniques that reduce American deception effectiveness. Some units have abandoned radio communications entirely, relying on wire networks and messenger runners that can't be intercepted or manipulated. The implications for Operation Downfall are ominous. Japanese homeland defenses will employ communication security measures refined through years of experience with American frequency intrusion techniques. The psychological advantages that proved so effective against isolated island garrisons may not exist among troops defending their homeland with months to prepare for invasion. Sullivan's recommendation proves prophetic. Frequency intrusion techniques must continue evolving or they will become obsolete. The Japanese are learning to turn their communication weaknesses into strengths by abandoning vulnerable systems entirely. American forces must develop new methods of psychological warfare that don't depend on enemy radio networks. April 1945. Sullivan receives assignment to a classified project at the Army Security Agency facility in Arlington, Virginia. His mission: develop communication warfare techniques for use against Japanese homeland defenses During Operation Downfall, the project brings together specialists from across the American intelligence community, creating the most sophisticated communication warfare unit in military history. The team includes Navy cryptographers who broke Japanese diplomatic codes, Army signal intelligence officers who mapped enemy communication networks across the Pacific, and civilian psychologists who study the behavioral impact of information warfare. Together, they represent the cutting edge of what will eventually become known as psychological operations. Their analysis reveals disturbing intelligence about Japanese preparations for homeland defense. Enemy forces have learned from 3 years of American frequency intrusion techniques. Communication security measures now include redundant authentication systems, frequency rotation every 15 minutes, and backup cable networks that can't be intercepted electronically. More significantly, Japanese psychological preparation for invasion includes specific training on American communication deception techniques. Captured training documents reveal that enemy radio operators are taught to assume that any unexpected transmission might be American deception. The paranoia that Sullivan's team created as a byproduct of frequency intrusion has been institutionalized into Japanese defensive doctrine. The challenge becomes creating communication warfare techniques that overcome enemy preparations specifically designed to counter them. Sullivan's solution involves abandoning frequency intrusion entirely in favor of more sophisticated psychological warfare that exploits Japanese cultural and military traditions rather than their radio networks. His new techniques focus on exploiting Japanese command structure psychology rather than communication technology. American forces will broadcast false orders that seem to come from Emperor Hirohito himself, exploiting Japanese reverence for imperial authority. They will create fake radio personalities representing famous Japanese military leaders, issuing contradictory guidance that creates confusion about overall strategy. Most innovatively, Sullivan's team plans to exploit Japanese shame culture by broadcasting false reports of unit failures and commander incompetence. The psychological pressure of perceived disgrace will disrupt Japanese military effectiveness more than technical communication failures ever could. May 8, 1945, Germany surrenders, freeing American resources for the Pacific War's final phase. Sullivan's communication warfare unit receives additional personnel and equipment as the military prepares for Operation Downfall. The planned invasion of Japan will be the largest amphibious operation in history, requiring communication warfare capabilities that dwarf anything attempted during the island campaigns. But Sullivan knows something has changed fundamentally about his role in the war. Frequency intrusion began as his unauthorized innovation, developed through individual initiative and implemented despite official resistance. Now it has become institutional, managed by committees and implemented through bureaucratic procedures. The technique that started with one Marine radio operator improvising solutions in a jungle foxhole has evolved into sophisticated psychological warfare conducted by dozens of specialists using million-dollar equipment. The innovation has been successful beyond Sullivan's wildest imagination, but it no longer belongs to him. More troubling, Sullivan realizes that frequency intrusion's very success may have made it obsolete. The Japanese have adapted their defenses specifically to counter the techniques he pioneered. What worked brilliantly against enemy forces who had never encountered systematic communication deception may fail completely against defenders who have spent months preparing for exactly those methods. The war has outgrown its innovations, and the innovations must evolve again or become historical curiosities. Sullivan's greatest challenge isn't developing new techniques for the invasion of Japan. It's accepting that the technique he created has become something larger than any individual contribution. August 6, 1945. The atomic bomb drops on Hiroshima, changing warfare forever and making Operation Downfall unnecessary. Japan surrenders 9 days later, ending World War II before Sullivan's evolved communication warfare techniques face their ultimate test against homeland defenses. The war ends, but frequency intrusion's influence continues expanding through American military doctrine, intelligence operations, and eventually civilian applications that reshape how the world understands information warfare. The technique that began with unauthorized transmissions on enemy radio networks becomes the foundation for psychological operations that continue influencing conflicts 80 years later. Technical Sergeant Daniel Sullivan returns to civilian life in September 1945, carrying knowledge that will remain classified for decades. His frequency intrusion techniques, officially credited to institutional development rather than individual innovation, become standard doctrine for American communication warfare units worldwide. But the real legacy isn't technical or institutional. It's conceptual. Sullivan proved that communication systems designed to coordinate friendly forces could be weaponized against enemy operations more effectively than conventional firepower. He demonstrated that psychological warfare could achieve strategic objectives through minimal resources applied with maximum creativity. Most importantly, he established that innovation in warfare comes not from following established doctrine, but from individual initiative willing to violate regulations when regulations prevent solutions to life-and-death problems. The technique that Danny Sullivan created in a jungle foxhole went far beyond World War II. What he didn't know as he packed his gear and headed home to San Francisco was that frequency intrusion would become the blueprint for information warfare in conflicts he couldn't imagine. October 1950, the Korean Peninsula erupts in warfare as Chinese forces pour across the Yalu River. American communication specialists, many trained in Sullivan's techniques, face a new enemy with different vulnerabilities. Chinese and North Korean forces use Soviet radio equipment with security procedures designed to counter Western intelligence methods, but they haven't encountered systematic frequency intrusion. Master Sergeant Robert Chen, one of Sullivan's original team members from Guadalcanal, now leads communication warfare operations for the 8th Army. The lessons learned against Japanese forces prove remarkably adaptable against communist troops. Chinese artillery coordination, dependent on radio networks connecting forward observers with gun positions, becomes vulnerable to the same misdirection techniques that worked in the Pacific. But the Korean conflict reveals new applications for frequency intrusion that Sullivan never anticipated. United Nations forces face massive Chinese human wave attacks that rely on precise timing between multiple assault units. When that timing breaks down through false coordination orders transmitted on enemy frequencies, even numerically superior attacks collapse into chaos. Chen's most successful operation occurs during the Battle of Chipyong-ni in February 1951. Chinese forces surround the 23rd Regimental Combat Team, preparing coordinated attacks from 4 directions simultaneously. Chen's communication warfare team intercepts Chinese coordination frequencies and begins systematic disruption of attack timing. The technique is elegant. Instead of preventing Chinese attacks entirely, Chen's operators delay them by minutes through false orders transmitted on enemy networks. The northern assault begins at 0300 hours as planned. The eastern attack delays until 0307 because of false reports of American reinforcements. The southern assault waits until 0315 after receiving fake orders to coordinate with artillery that never fires. The western attack launches at 0322 following authentication delays caused by American electronic interference. 7 minutes of staggered timing transforms a coordinated assault into 4 separate attacks that American defenders defeat individually. The surrounded regiment holds its positions and eventually breaks out, largely because Chinese numerical superiority becomes irrelevant when attacks arrive piecemeal rather than simultaneously. The Korean experience teaches American forces that frequency intrusion principles apply beyond specific equipment or languages. Any military force dependent on radio coordination becomes vulnerable to systematic communication deception. The psychological effects prove universal. Soldiers who can't trust their own radio networks make decisions based on fear rather than intelligence, regardless of their nationality or political system. December 1956. The Suez Crisis introduces frequency intrusion to a new generation of conflicts. British and French forces, attacking Egyptian positions, employ communication warfare specialists trained in Sullivan's techniques. Egyptian defenders, using Soviet equipment and procedures, discover that radio security designed for European warfare provides limited protection against psychological deception methods developed in the Pacific. Squadron leader James Mitchell of the Royal Air Force, studying captured Egyptian communication logs, identifies patterns that would have been familiar to Sullivan 15 years earlier. Egyptian units receiving contradictory orders over radio, artillery strikes redirected through false coordinates transmitted on enemy frequencies, command structure paralysis caused by officers who stop trusting their own communication networks. The techniques work so effectively that Egyptian forces begin abandoning radio communications during critical operations, reverting to messenger runners and wire networks that slow their response times significantly. British forces exploit this communication paralysis to achieve tactical advantages that conventional firepower alone couldn't provide. But the Suez Crisis also reveals frequency intrusion's limitations in modern warfare. Television coverage brings international scrutiny that makes prolonged deception campaigns politically impossible. The technique that worked brilliantly during World War II's information blackout becomes problematic when global media can expose communication warfare methods in real time. More importantly, the Soviet Union begins developing counter-techniques specifically designed to defeat Western frequency intrusion methods. Russian communication specialists, studying American techniques through captured equipment and interrogated prisoners, create security procedures that make systematic radio deception much more difficult. 1961. The Bay of Pigs invasion demonstrates both the power and the dangers of frequency intrusion in Cold War conflicts. CIA communication specialists, trained in Sullivan's methods, attempt to create coordination chaos among Cuban defenders through false radio transmissions. The technique works initially, disrupting Cuban military response during the landing phase. But Cuban forces, advised by Soviet specialists familiar with American communication warfare methods, implement countermeasures faster than expected. Within hours, Cuban radio operators begin using authentication codes and frequency rotation procedures that neutralize most American deception attempts. More devastatingly, Cuban intelligence services capture American frequency intrusion equipment and use it to broadcast false orders to CIA-supported invasion forces. The technique that American forces developed to confuse enemy operations becomes a weapon against American operations when enemies learn to employ the same methods. The Bay of Pigs failure teaches the CIA a crucial lesson that Sullivan understood intuitively during World War II. Frequency intrusion works best against enemies who don't expect it. Once adversaries develop specific countermeasures, the technique becomes a double-edged sword that can damage friendly forces as much as enemy operations. 1965. Vietnam presents frequency intrusion specialists with their most complex challenge yet. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces employ communication methods ranging from sophisticated Soviet radio equipment to primitive field telephone networks that resist electronic interference. American communication warfare units must adapt Sullivan's techniques to work against enemies using multiple incompatible systems simultaneously. Colonel Michael Kowalski, another veteran of Sullivan's original team, commands communication warfare operations for Military Assistance Command Vietnam. His units face an enemy that has learned from 20 years of American frequency intrusion techniques and developed countermeasures specifically designed to neutralize them. North Vietnamese forces use minimal radio communications during offensive operations, relying instead on pre-positioned supplies and predetermined attack plans that don't require real-time coordination. When they do use radio, they employ authentication procedures and code systems that make impersonation extremely difficult. Kowalski's solution involves abandoning traditional frequency intrusion in favor of what he calls communication pressure. Instead of trying to deceive North Vietnamese forces directly, his units create electronic interference that forces enemy operators to repeat transmissions multiple times, providing American intelligence with detailed information about enemy operations. The technique proves remarkably effective because it exploits human psychology rather than technical vulnerabilities. North Vietnamese radio operators, stressed by constant American electronic warfare, make mistakes they would never make under normal conditions. They violate their own security procedures when communication problems mount. They use simplified codes when complex authentication becomes too time-consuming during emergencies. But Vietnam also reveals frequency intrusion's evolution into something far more sophisticated than Sullivan ever imagined. American forces employ computer-controlled transmitters that can simultaneously broadcast false orders on dozens of enemy frequencies. Direction-finding networks locate enemy radio positions within seconds of transmission. Most significantly, psychological profiles help craft deceptions tailored to specific North Vietnamese commanders and their known behavioral patterns. The technique that began with one Marine improvising solutions in a foxhole has become institutionalized warfare conducted by hundreds of specialists using millions of dollars of equipment. But the fundamental insight remains unchanged. Enemy communication systems can be turned into weapons against enemy forces more effectively than conventional firepower. 1973. The Yom Kippur War introduces frequency intrusion to Middle Eastern warfare, as Israeli forces employ communication deception techniques against Egyptian and Syrian attackers. Israeli communication specialists, trained in American methods, discover that Arab forces using Soviet equipment remain vulnerable to systematic radio deception despite 28 years of technological advancement since World War II. The techniques work because human psychology remains constant even as technology evolves. Syrian tank commanders receiving contradictory orders over radio react with the same confusion that Japanese artillery observers displayed 30 years earlier. Egyptian air defense operators, flooded with false target information transmitted on their own frequencies, make the same targeting errors that plagued Japanese anti-aircraft units during Pacific Island battles. But the 1973 conflict also demonstrates how frequency intrusion has spread beyond American forces to become standard doctrine for militaries worldwide. Syrian intelligence services attempt their own communication deception against Israeli forces. Egyptian electronic warfare units try to disrupt Israeli coordination through false radio transmissions. The technique that Sullivan pioneered as an American innovation has become universal military knowledge. 1982. The Falklands War shows how frequency intrusion techniques adapt to modern warfare conditions. British forces, attacking Argentine positions, employ sophisticated electronic warfare capabilities that would astound Sullivan but follow principles he established 40 years earlier. Argentine defenders discover that even modern communication security provides limited protection against systematic psychological deception. Royal Navy electronic warfare specialists aboard HMS Hermes coordinate frequency intrusion operations that span hundreds of miles. They don't simply transmit false orders on Argentine frequencies. They orchestrate complex deception campaigns involving multiple false radio personalities, elaborate fictional scenarios, and psychological pressure designed to exploit specific weaknesses in Argentine military culture. The sophistication level reflects 4 decades of technological advancement, but the fundamental concept remains unchanged. Argentine forces, unable to trust their own communication networks, begin making decisions based on fear rather than intelligence. Their operational effectiveness degrades not because of superior British firepower, but because they can't coordinate their own operations effectively. Flight Lieutenant Sarah Wellington, analyzing captured Argentine communication logs, identifies patterns that echo Sullivan's original observations from Guadalcanal. Enemy forces wasting ammunition on false targets, units moving to counter threats that don't exist, command paralysis caused by officers who question every radio transmission they receive. The Falklands experience proves that frequency intrusion principles transcend specific conflicts, technologies, or adversaries. Any military force dependent on radio coordination becomes vulnerable to communication warfare regardless of equipment's sophistication or security procedures. 1991. The Gulf War represents frequency intrusion's most technologically advanced application. American forces employ satellite-based communication warfare systems that can simultaneously monitor and manipulate thousands of Iraqi radio frequencies. The capability would seem like science fiction to Sullivan, but the psychological principles remain identical to those he discovered in 1942. Iraqi forces, defending against coalition attacks, employ Soviet-designed communication systems with security features specifically intended to counter Western electronic warfare. But technical security proves inadequate against systematic psychological pressure applied through their own radio networks. Coalition electronic warfare specialists don't simply disrupt Iraqi communications, they weaponize them. False orders transmitted on Iraqi command frequencies create coordination chaos during critical defensive operations. Artillery strikes redirected through frequency intrusion waste thousands of rounds on empty desert. Most devastatingly, Iraqi commanders begin questioning legitimate orders because they can't distinguish authentic transmissions from coalition deceptions. The psychological impact proves decisive during the 100-hour ground campaign. Iraqi units, paralyzed by communication uncertainty, fail to coordinate effective resistance against coalition advances. Their defensive positions, expertly prepared and adequately supplied, become isolated strong points that coalition forces bypass or eliminate individually. Major General Charles Horner, commanding coalition air operations, credits communication warfare with contributing significantly to the campaign's speed and low casualties. In his post-war analysis, he notes that Iraqi forces possessed excellent equipment and competent personnel, but their inability to coordinate operations effectively neutralized these advantages. The Gulf War demonstrates frequency intrusion's evolution into strategic warfare capability. The technique that Sullivan developed to save his fellow Marines has become a tool for achieving decisive victory with minimal casualties. But success creates new challenges as potential adversaries study American methods and develop specific countermeasures. 2001. Afghanistan introduces frequency intrusion to asymmetric warfare as American forces face enemies who deliberately avoid radio communications to prevent interception. Taliban and Al-Qaeda fighters employ primitive communication methods specifically chosen to resist electronic warfare techniques. The challenge forces American communication specialists to develop new applications for frequency intrusion principles. Instead of deceiving enemy radio networks, they create false communications that manipulate enemy behavior indirectly. Fake radio traffic suggesting American troop movements causes Taliban forces to reposition unnecessarily. False reports of capture operations broadcast on frequencies Taliban monitors force insurgent leaders to abandon safe houses prematurely. Master Sergeant James Running Bear, grandson of Sullivan's original team member, leads communication warfare operations in eastern Afghanistan. His techniques reflect 60 years of doctrinal evolution, but the fundamental insight remains remains unchanged. Enemies who fear deception often damage themselves more than actual deception ever could. Taliban forces, knowing American electronic warfare capabilities, become so paranoid about radio interception that they severely limit their own coordination. Their operational effectiveness suffers not from American interference, but from self-imposed communication restrictions designed to prevent American interference. The Afghanistan experience teaches a new generation of communication specialists that frequency intrusion's greatest power lies not in technical deception, but in psychological pressure that forces enemies to defeat themselves while trying to defend against American capabilities. 2003. Iraq presents communication warfare specialists with urban environments that amplify frequency intrusion's effectiveness. American forces discover that city fighting, with its complex terrain and civilian populations, creates ideal conditions for the systematic communication deception that Sullivan pioneered 60 years earlier. Iraqi forces, defending urban positions, require constant radio coordination between scattered units. When that coordination breaks down through false orders transmitted on their own frequencies, even well-prepared defenses collapse rapidly. American units exploit communication chaos to advance through city districts that conventional tactics might require weeks to clear. The urban environment also provides new opportunities for psychological warfare applications of frequency intrusion. False radio reports of civilian casualties cause Iraqi commanders to hesitate during critical operations. Fake communications suggesting American war crimes broadcast on frequencies Iraqi intelligence monitors create political pressure that disrupts military decision-making. Lieutenant Colonel Maria Santos, commanding communication warfare operations in Baghdad, employs techniques that would be recognizable to Sullivan despite 7 decades of technological advancement. Her teams monitor enemy radio traffic, identify vulnerable moments when confusion runs high, then inject false information that amplifies existing problems. The results match those Sullivan achieved against Japanese forces in 1942. Iraqi units waste ammunition attacking positions American forces abandoned hours earlier. Enemy reinforcements move to counter threats that exist only on radio frequencies. Most significantly, Iraqi commanders begin questioning orders that seem too convenient for American operations, even when those orders are completely authentic. But Iraq also reveals frequency intrusion's limitations in modern information warfare. Global media coverage makes prolonged deception campaigns politically difficult. International law increasingly restricts communication warfare techniques that affect civilian populations. The method that worked brilliantly during World War II's information blackout becomes problematic in an era of instant global communication. 2014. Ukraine demonstrates how frequency intrusion techniques have spread beyond conventional military forces to become tools of irregular warfare. Russian-backed separatists employ communication deception methods against Ukrainian government forces, proving that Sullivan's innovations have become universal military knowledge. Ukrainian forces discover that modern communication security provides limited protection against systematic psychological pressure applied through their own radio networks. Separatist electronic warfare units, trained in Russian techniques derived from American methods, create coordination chaos that amplifies the confusion inherent in irregular warfare. The conflict shows how frequency intrusion principles adapt to contemporary warfare conditions. Social media becomes a new vector for communication deception. Internet-based communication systems prove vulnerable to the same psychological manipulation techniques that worked against radio networks 70 years earlier. Colonel Alexei Petrov, analyzing captured Ukrainian communication equipment, identifies patterns that echo every conflict since Sullivan's original innovation. Enemy forces making decisions based on fear rather than intelligence. Coordination failures that amplify battlefield confusion. Command paralysis caused by leaders who can't trust their own communication networks. Ukraine proves that frequency intrusion has become a permanent feature of modern warfare, constantly evolving but always based on Sullivan's fundamental insight that enemy communication systems can be weaponized against enemy operations. 2024, 82 years after Sullivan's first unauthorized transmission on Guadalcanal, frequency intrusion principles influence conflicts worldwide. Modern militaries employ sophisticated cyber warfare capabilities that extend communication deception far beyond radio frequencies to encompass internet protocols, satellite communications, and artificial intelligence systems. The techniques have evolved far beyond what Sullivan could have imagined, but the psychological principles remain unchanged. Military forces dependent on electronic communication remain vulnerable to systematic deception applied through their own networks. The fear of communication manipulation continues, causing operational damage that exceeds actual manipulation in many conflicts. Contemporary warfare specialists study Sullivan's original innovation not for its technical methods, which have become obsolete, but for its conceptual breakthrough. He proved that warfare extends beyond kinetic destruction to include information manipulation, psychological pressure, and communication weaponization. Modern cyber warfare, electronic warfare, and information operations all trace intellectual lineage to the moment when one Marine radio operator decided that enemy voices on radio frequencies were weapons waiting to be turned against enemy operations. The lesson endures across 8 decades of technological change. The most effective innovations often come not from following established doctrine, but from individuals willing to violate regulations when regulations prevent solutions to life-and-death problems. Sullivan's legacy lives in every communication specialist who understands that radio waves carry more than information. They carry trust, fear, confusion, and certainty. The frequency intrusion techniques he pioneered remain classified in many applications, but their influence shapes how modern militaries think about information warfare, psychological operations, and the weaponization of communication systems. The technique that began with unauthorized transmissions in a jungle foxhole became the foundation for information warfare doctrine that continues evolving today. Not bad for a young Marine who just wanted to save his fellow Marines from Japanese artillery fire. Danny Sullivan never sought recognition for what he'd accomplished. When the Marine Corps offered him a commission and assignment to the newly formed Communication Intelligence Division in 1946, he declined. When defense contractors offered lucrative consulting positions developing electronic warfare systems, he turned them down. When military historians asked for interviews about his revolutionary techniques, he politely refused. Instead, Sullivan returned to San Francisco and used his GI Bill benefits to study electrical engineering at UC Berkeley. He graduated in 1949, married his high school sweetheart Mary, and took a job with Pacific Telephone Company installing communication lines across Northern California. For 37 years, he climbed telephone poles, repaired switching equipment, and maintained the civilian communication networks that connected communities throughout the Bay Area. His co-workers knew he was a Marine veteran. They knew he'd served in the Pacific. But Sullivan never mentioned frequency intrusion, never discussed his role in revolutionizing radio warfare, never spoke about the thousands of lives his techniques had saved. When younger technicians asked about his military service, he'd shrug and say he'd been a radio operator. Nothing special. The only hint of his wartime innovation came during technical problems that baffled other engineers. Sullivan possessed an intuitive understanding of how radio signals behaved under stress, how human psychology affected communication reliability, how systems designed for one purpose could be adapted for entirely different applications. His solutions often violated established procedures, but always worked. In 1983, a Pacific telephone supervisor, writing Sullivan's retirement evaluation, noted his unusual problem-solving approach. Dan Sullivan thinks outside normal parameters, the report stated. His methods are unconventional but effective. He sees possibilities in communication systems that others miss. Excellent technical intuition. Sullivan died quietly at home in 1987, surrounded by family who knew him as a devoted husband, father and grandfather, who fixed their radios when they broke. His obituary in the San Francisco Chronicle mentioned his 37 years with Pacific Telephone and his service as a Marine radio operator in World War II. It didn't mention that his unauthorized experiments with enemy frequencies had revolutionized warfare, saved thousands of lives, and established principles that continue shaping military communications today. But maybe that's exactly how Danny Sullivan would have wanted it. Sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who never needed the world to know they were heroes.